everybody, and welcome to my latest A-level politics video. In this one we are looking at the US Congress, and we're looking at one of its key functions, which is representation. Now this is a really important issue, and it's one that not all people in America are necessarily happy at in terms of the job that Congress does. There are lots of really interesting things about theories of representation. There's also lots and lots of different factors that impact on the actions of congressmen and senators and how they carry out their duties and who it is they really are representing. So the Spec tells us this is what you need to know. This is part of 2.2, the functions of Congress. This is 2.2.1, representation, congressional elections and the significance of incumbency, and we're going to see that incumbency is massively significant, and factors affecting voting behaviour within Congress, parties and caucuses, constituency, pressure groups and lobbyists. And so we will look at all of those and some other things besides to make sure you've got a full understanding of this particular function of Congress, and particularly the factors that affect the way that people in Congress vote. Now, there's some really interesting things that comes into this. We're looking at potential difference between representation and being representative. Now, they're two different things. So the UK and the US is a representative democracy. So, and in this, people are elected to represent in America their state. You get two senators from each state, and they represent the whole state, or to represent a district within their state. And that for the House of Representatives, that's how it's divided up. It's divided up into different congressional districts. Now there are different models of representation. These apply both in the UK and in the US. So there's the delegate model, and the idea of this is that a member of Congress would make decisions based on the wishes of their constituents rather than on their personal judgments. Now this can actually, the delegate role can play quite an important role in the House in particular, where they're re-elected every 2 years. So if you don't, to some extent, use the delegate model and you aren't putting across the wishes of your constituents, then there's a good chance you won't get elected again, because with such a short time in office, it's very clear whether you have or haven't stuck to what the people wanted you to do. The other model, and most people argue this is the predominant one, both in the US and in the UK, is the trustee model. And the idea of this is people make decisions based on their own beliefs, and they go on the idea that voters have put their trusts in them to make a decision. It goes back to the ideas of Burke and Madison, and it is probably the most accurate model for most members of Congress. Definitely, I would say, for the Senate, and probably in the case of the House of Representatives as well. So that's representation. How about being representative? Well, is Congress representative? Meaning, does Congress look like the population of the USA? And the short answer to that is no, it doesn't. It's too male, it's too white, it's too old, it's too Christian, it's too well educated, it's too professional. So a lot of the people there, they come from higher ends of business and legal professions in particular, again similar to Parliament in the UK. So the next question is, well, does this really matter? Well, most people believe the answer to that is yes, and obviously you get a bit of a split on that, and it tends to be a split on whether you are from the groups that predominate in Congress, or if you're not. And if you're not, then most people would say, right, actually this really does matter, because Congress will not see issues in the same way that the people that are being represented, or the people who live in the USA, do. So you will end up with a skewed view of the world and of legislation and what needs doing, and therefore you will get groups who are not considered properly, whose views are not thought about, and as much as people can try this, particularly if you're doing the trustee model, then if you meet all the stereotypes or the majority characteristics of what I've said that Congress is like, then if these people are then making decisions off their own back, then they're not going to be thinking necessarily in a way that would benefit everybody. It makes it very difficult with the delegate model because you're trying to represent often hugely diverse populations. So this is, again, how representative it is a really interesting issue. Now, in 2020, we're seeing some shifts, things that it's becoming more representative, but there's still some fairly major gaps. And I've tried to get as up to date as I can with this data, but some of it, again, will be worth watching once all the dust settles in 2020 and we get an accurate picture once all the congressional races and all the other shenanigans going around the election are over. So, as a population, the American population is slightly more female than it is male. Congress is overwhelmingly the other way. So getting on for 3/4 of Congress is male, only just over a quarter is female. Now, to put this into real context, 2020 has seen the most female members of Congress elected ever. And still, it's only just over a quarter. So we can see women are massively underrepresented in Congress. We can see similar things based on race. So we can see that both African Americans and Hispanic Americans are underrepresented, and this was the case in 2018. There has been some improvement in 2020. I haven't got the exact numbers yet, but again, they could be becoming freely available over the next few months. The gap is particularly big for Hispanic Americans, and we are seeing at the moment, as I make this video, calls from Hispanic caucus in Congress and from the Hispanic community for Biden's cabinet to reflect the full diversity of America, and particularly to reflect their groups. Now, we're seeing those demands in cabinet. Now, one of the things that's going to be interesting for the political parties is going forward, particularly as the Hispanic population in particular grows, is unless whichever party does a better job of showing it represents that community, we'll see the benefits in elections, I'm sure. Another really interesting one is on religious affiliation. The US Congress is far more religious than the population of America as a whole, in particular Protestant and evangelicals and Catholics. So whilst of the population, only 77% claim to have a religious affiliation, in Congress it's 98%. So this might well tell us some interesting things about when Congress is debating issues such as abortion and things like that why maybe might not seem to be completely in touch with the population as a whole. So different groups will feel that they aren't very well represented, and the statistics would bear that out. The 2020 Congress does look like it's going to be the most diverse ever, but there are still going to be really significant gaps. So it's always worth watching out for, kind of in questions and when writing about Congress, is that difference between representation and representative. And you will have your own opinion and what you feel about whether this stuff really matters or whether it doesn't. In theory, a really good representative should be able to represent all types of different people, no matter how different they are, and then particularly if they spend the time to find out about other viewpoints and other ways of looking at things. Is that the reality of what happens? I'm less sure of. Congressional elections are frequent and regular. One of the wonders of teaching American politics and American history is that as long as you can work out when one presidential election was, you can work out when all of them were, because they take place in regular cycles. The House of Representatives is elected every 2 years. The aim of this is to make it highly responsive to public opinion, and therefore it tends to shift a bit more than the Senate does, where the Senate is senators are elected for 6 years, though it works in a cycle where a third of the Senate is elected every 2 years. So you don't have a whole change of the Senate, but you do have a whole change of the House every 2 years. Both systems are in the main part use first past the post, so you got winner takes all. And this skews results, because if you've got a Senate seat where you stack them up and you win by an absolute mile, then that's no better really than if you just win by a couple of hundred votes. There is some variation on the way that the system works. So, for example, we're just waiting in the moment for the runoff in Georgia, where the state rules are that a winner has to get over 50% of the vote. So, building a bit of a majoritarian system into that. Now, we do see some fluctuations, but maybe not as much as you would expect, particularly with elections every 2 years in the House. Just like with the election of a president, congressional elections have primaries, and so again an incumbent can be challenged that way, or if an incumbent steps down, then or for the party that's been opposing the incumbent, you can have a race in that again. So it can be quite a long and drawn out process where there's not a huge gap in campaigning if you're trying to get into the House. In midterm elections, presidents tend to lose seats. There are really 3 big exceptions to this, which are Roosevelt in 1934, Clinton in 1998, and Bush in 2002. Other than that, what happens is a president, if they have control of Congress when they come into power, they tend to lose it halfway through, or lose seats at that point at least. Sometimes the midterms we see big national campaigns leading to a clear mandate for the House Speaker. So, for example, we saw a Contract with America by Newt Gingrich back in '94, which was about conservative economic policy and restricting government spending. And most of the Republicans who won signed up to that. And again, that gave them a very, very strong base to say, look, this is what the people want. We saw the 100-hour agenda by Nancy Pelosi in 2006, which was a really ambitious 6-day program, including things like increasing the minimum wage, halving interest rates on student loan. And generally speaking, again, this was very successful, and we saw a kind of a real shift in policy because of it. And again, Bush having to follow through on a lot of what was being demanded. Now, midterm setbacks can really negatively impact on a president. So, for example, Obama lost the House in 2010, lost the Senate. The Democrats lost the House and then the Senate in 2010 and 2014, respectively. And Obama's kind of program came to a grinding halt at that point, and we saw a lot of partisan tension in Congress. And similar under Trump, Trump lost the House in 2018, and from that point onwards, it's found it very, very hard to carry out any of his agenda. And we've seen the impeachment and the clashes between him and Nancy Pelosi and other leading Democrats. So, as I hinted at earlier, the incumbency is a really, really important thing. So, the incumbent is the person who already holds a seat. So, if you're the incumbent and you run again, so you were the senator for that state, or you were the member of Congress for that district, and you run again, the chances are you will win. The success rates are ridiculously high. I mean, 2016, we're talking a 97% success rate for incumbents in the House, not a 90% for senators, and that's not an anomaly. That's fairly consistent through American history. I mean, the incumbency success rate in the House did drop in '98 to 91%, but we're still over 90%. The fact that so few seats change hands when there's an incumbent in place would seem to suggest that congressional elections have little impact. However, the changes that do happen can be really significant and can swing the balance of power. Now, a bit like in the UK, where we have safe seats and marginals, in America, you have swing seats and they have safe seats. So there are some places where you just know that the Democrat or the Senate or the Republicans are going to win the Senate or that particular district, and they're just absolutely solid. And where the interest comes every 2 years is on the seats where it's not completely solid, and that's where differences can be made. And obviously the other thing to be said is not all incumbents run for every single election ever going forward. So you'll have an incumbent and they'll do really well and they'll be there for a period of time, and then they might move on to something else or retire or whatever else, and at that point it could become more of a race again. But being an incumbent makes you really hard to beat, and this applies even more strongly in Congress than it does for presidents, and though obviously the occasional president has some real difficulty dealing with it when they lose as an incumbent. So why is it such an advantage? Well, some of this is just horrendously corrupt. So gerrymandering. So gerrymandering is when you draw up boundaries, electoral boundaries, to suit you and make sure that you win. Now, in 31 of the 50 states, the state legislature draws up the congressional boundaries, and therefore, if you have Republicans in charge of the state legislature, then you have them in charge of drawing up the congressional boundaries, and therefore they will tend to set them up to favour Republicans and vice versa with the Democrats. Now, this is actually, and we're going to use the Republicans as an example, because this has actually been a definitive tactic by the Republicans since Obama's win in 2008. The worst case of it is in Pennsylvania. Now, Pennsylvania had traditionally been a Democrat state. The Republicans won the control of the state legislature and redrew the boundaries. After redrawing the boundaries, they won 13 of the 18 congressional districts, despite losing the overall vote within the state by 100,000 to the Democrats. There's an image above me of the slightly weird drawn congressional district. It's said to look like Goofy kicking Donald Duck, and it was drawn specifically to make sure that you got as many Republicans through as possible. In 2018, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania struck down these boundaries as they broke the Pennsylvania Constitution. The Republicans took this to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that federal courts could not challenge state-created boundaries, ending the Republican challenge. So there has been electoral rigging in Pennsylvania, but it wasn't in 2020, and it wasn't by the Democrats. Sorry, Mr. Trump. This isn't looking good. We see this in all kinds of other places. I've been teaching modern Britain, and we'll look at Londonderry or Derry, and again I've been teaching students about that there. So gerrymandering is not a uniquely American thing, but it's just not right, is it? I mean, so we see this mechanism of state control, and it's leading to a manipulation of the result. In more recent elections after the Supreme Court ruling, then we've seen it move to 9-9 in Pennsylvania. So it has made a big difference. So incumbents can get in because things have been gerrymandered on their behalf, and that can help them stay in place. So, and once you've got a party in control somewhere, then that can be really important. What other advantage do they have? Well, they have safe seats. So first past the post, winner takes all. So seats are very secure under this system, with little possible change. So if you're getting over 50% of the vote in your state and winning comfortably, then the chances are that nothing will dramatically change. And we see increasingly partisan politics in America, so this is likely to increase rather than decrease. An incumbent can use their office to attract media attention, to attract donors. They have the opportunity to create a track record where they can turn around to their supporters and say, I did this. And one of the ways they can turn around and say, I did this, is what's known as pork barrel legislation, or pork barreling. Now, This is again something that looks rather corrupt, but it can be a huge benefit if you're on the receiving end of it, where congressmen or senators will be asked to support something, and they go, "Oh, I'm not really sure. If I told you there's this really big issue in my district or my state, we really need some investment in something." And in an attempt to try and get it through, the party leadership or presidents, representatives might agree that, well, actually, what we'll do, we'll pass that bit of legislation, and we'll add this bit of infrastructure building in your state, or commission the building of some new boats, even though we don't want them, and research has proven they're not effective. But we see that your state does shipbuilding, and yes, we need your support on this. So it can hugely benefit a person's district, a person's state, and it can help American people. It means that there can be jobs and improved infrastructure and all that kind of thing. But it's very much a bit of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. And again, this is one of the things that can give Congress a bad name. People tend to like pork barreling when it's done for them, and they don't like pork barreling where it's going to places where they don't live, if that makes sense. Incumbents have huge financial advantages. It becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the statistics are so weighted towards the incumbents. Then it's far easier for them to raise money. They raise on average 7 times or more than the people challenging them, and therefore because they spend more on the election than the challenger, there's a reason why people spend lots of money on elections, and that it tends to help them win. So incumbents have this huge list of advantages. Some of them you might look at and go, that's not hugely democratic, but they are advantages nonetheless. The voting behaviour within Congress is a really interesting and complex thing. So there's a whole range of factors that impact on the way members of Congress vote. Some of these I'll explore in more detail, such as parties and caucuses and constituency and pressure groups and lobbyists. But there are some other factors that come in. It's difficult to pin absolutely everything down. So some of these things can be the electoral cycle. So how close am I to being re-elected? So the senator, as they approach the end of their 6 years, might behave differently than they did right near the beginning. It might depend on the popularity or lack of it that the president has. So if you've got a hugely popular president, whether you're their party or the other, then opposing their legislation, it might not be a great thing to do politically if your constituents have just voted for that president in large numbers. It might depend on how safe your seat is as a senator or member of Congress. If your seat is really, really safe, then you're more likely to do as you want and not be pressured into it by other things. If you've got a very marginal seat, then you might need to consider some of the factors a lot more closely. It might come down to your ambition and whether you intend standing going forward. So if you're looking for a top job on a committee, or you are looking for further progress within the party, then you probably want to stick to the party line. If you're not, then this is when you can step out of line. And we've seen a really good example of this recently, where the Republican members of Congress who have not stood for re-election, those who were just about to stand down, have been some of the few Republicans who turned around and criticised Trump over his election claims and said, look, this is over and it's done. Those who are going to have got any ambitions for the future and are going forward, and Trump might run again in 2024, are being a bit more reticent about publicly saying anything. So there are a whole range of things that can impact on how they vote and how they behave. Parties in the US don't have quite the strength of party discipline that we see in the UK. Now you can get pressure from party leadership for the representatives to follow the party line. There are a majority and minority whips and kind of people below them who work with them, and their job is to push the party's agenda and ensure that these votes are required for legislation. It's well worth watching some kind of American political drama to get a feeling of how this kind of stuff works, something like The West Wing or House of Cards, and you can see how pressure's applied. And it's similar to again the whip system in the UK, but they don't have quite the power that we see in the UK because of the separation of powers and various other things. Each party's caucus, caucuses are groups within within the Congress, and the party's caucus is everybody in that party. You'll see there's different types of caucuses as well, and they meet weekly, and the party leaders will tend to take the meetings, and they'll try and stir up support for particular proposals or legislation, or to make sure that they're blocking legislation from the other side. There is some power of patronage, such as promising of positions at the top of chairmanship of committees and things like that. But it's obviously not something you can just use all the time. And there's also some use of the pork barreling that we've seen, where it kind of, well, okay, if you back this, we'll give you that type thing. But it's not quite the same as it is in the UK. But and so in the US, like we also see in the UK, we see representatives voting against their party. It can be really, really frequent in the US. Now, there are whole kinds of different caucuses in Congress. So this kind of getting together as a group gives members of Congress a greater voice, because they form like a power block. And you're then negotiating with party leaders or with a president who's trying to get a bill passed. If you can go to them as a caucus and say, actually, we're a block of 100 votes or 40 votes or whatever it is, then this can make a big difference. Sometimes it reflects the factions within the political parties. So, for example, there are caucuses for Blue Dogs, and there are a caucus for the Progressives in the Democrat Party, and there are some good examples in the Republican Party. Here we've got the House Freedom Caucus, which is a highly conservative caucus, and we've got the Tuesday Group, which is a moderate caucus, and again the Republican Party leadership or a Republican president trying to get things through might meet with one of those caucuses to negotiate. Again, if they look forward to Biden, then he might sit down with the Tuesday Group and have a chance of getting some of his legislation passed. There are also caucuses that bring members together across party lines. So, for example, the Congressional Black Caucus, which is non-partisan, they're dominated by the Democrats, and that's made up of black members of Congress from both parties. There's a Hispanic Caucus, which is obviously similar but different group. And then we see other ones like the House Steel Caucus, which is congressional members whose districts include steelworks. These caucuses can play an important role when bills relate to their particular interests, or to make a particular point if they feel that the groups they represented have been disadvantaged from it. And so you might have something where you think, oh, it's a Democrat bill, it's going to pass through fine, but then actually one of these caucuses stands up and says, no, this is disadvantaging the area, these areas, these different people that we represent. And then we're seeing a different slightly with some of these caucuses, different ideas of representation. It's not just about representing your state; it's something bigger, something broader, and therefore can affect the way that people vote. The constituency is really important. So the members of Congress may be swayed by the views of their constituents more than party considerations, particularly if you're approaching election time. So they will think about how will them voting on a particular bill or taking a particular stance, how will that play well back home? Will it play badly? And that might sway the way that they vote. And now it should be the case with the House. We might see a bit more of the delegate model here, where they're kind of going, well, yeah, the party's telling me to vote for that, but they really aren't going to like this back in my district or back in my state, and therefore I can't support it, particularly because I'll probably lose the next election. And when they go back to their state, back to their home state or the home district, then members will have engagements and meetings with constituents, might have town hall meetings, might have constituent surgeries. They also receive huge amounts of mail, and they also do lots of kind of testings of public opinion within their state or district, and therefore there is an element of the delegate model in there. Pressure groups and lobbyists. Now, this is the bit that makes a lot of people mad, including me, and it's one of these bits that just looks wrong. Members of Congress, particularly in the House, face really frequent and expensive elections. So you could be facing primaries and then elections. So you're almost on a non-stop campaign. So they will often work with pressure groups, and if we try and put this nicely to start off, with pressure groups and lobbyists who share their beliefs and want them to do well, and therefore offer them financial support to help them with all their electioneering. It does look a lot like bribery and corruption. It might be that people are persuaded through being presented with research and data and argument and go, actually, I never thought about it in that way, but now you have convinced me. You are a brilliant lobbyist. You are a really effective pressure group. I will take this with me, and that will affect how I vote. It might be because they give you a large wad of money to help you with your next election. Again, it's difficult to say this is absolute corruption, because sometimes that is the case, that you've got a pressure group that persuades congressmen, and then they convince them of the environmental crisis, and so they start changing the way that they vote in Congress. But it can be that they're a group like the NRA who back huge numbers of members of Congress, both sides, and give them financial support, and then you wonder why gun legislation keeps failing when the NRA bankroll a load of people in Congress. Now, I think on that one, I'm fairly confident I'm putting two and two together and getting 4. Now, there are, again, you can't absolutely prove it, and you can go back to the other bits and go, well, actually, what do the constituents think? And maybe the constituents all believe in gun rights, and therefore this is actually nothing to do with the NRA giving them loads of money, and it might be their own, it might be trustee model, it might be their own heartfelt belief, and that's why the NRA work with them, because they know that they are true believers in gun rights. And again, it's complicated, but there is enough there to maybe be slightly skeptical in terms of what's going on. So overall, do members of Congress do a good job of representing the people? Well, there's some really interesting statistics on this. A Gallup poll in 2016 said that they disapproved of the job being done by Congress. That's quite a big number. And there was another poll, and it was about the same time, and this listed things that members of Congress were less popular than. It included traffic jams, lice, and cockroaches. I think they might be sharing in my skepticism when it comes to things like lobbyists and pressure groups. So if there's, and this is the bit where the data and stuff doesn't really make a huge amount of sense. So incumbents just win all the time. People think they're doing a terrible job. How does that happen? Well, some of it is well, we've got to look at the whole range of factors. Some of it is partisan voting. So you might be sceptical about the person you've elected, but you might be equally sceptical or more sceptical about the person who's running against them. Now, you might think pork barrelling is wrong, but your particular member of Congress or Senate might have done a really good job at bringing a load of money into your area through some pork barrelling. So you might be really happy about pork barrelling because it's happening and bringing stuff to your state, but you're really unhappy about the other pork barrelling that's happening, that's meaning that the government overall spending is gigantic and there's stuff going to states that you don't care about in other parts of the country. There's a very strong argument to just say a straight no to it, in that it's that actually Congress has become far too partisan, and we've seen that particularly during Trump's term. There are a number of safe seats when nothing's going to change, and therefore the first past the post system, a bit like in the UK, is not doing anybody any favours. As incumbents get re-elected and their safe seats become really safe, then they tend to become even more partisan, even more extreme, and so we keep getting the gridlock in Congress when nothing happens, and gridlock is a real problem. Now, there is an argument that says yes, so a president becomes unpopular, it is then Congress that steps in and just stops them doing what they want. So a president might well have been relatively popular when they first win. It might be then very clear that people don't like what they're doing, and 2 years later the brakes kick in, and the president is stopped from doing the stuff that people don't want them to do. And in that case, it's doing a good job. And the frequent elections means that it can be highly responsive to public opinion. And like with all systems and all things, you will get brilliant members of the House of Representatives, and you will get amazing senators, and they will do an absolutely cracking job, and they will be genuinely caring about their constituents and doing their absolute best for them, and will be brilliant public servants. And there will be others who will be making loads of money through it, and will be looking for really good jobs later on as lobbyists, or working with the pressure groups that have been helping fund them, and making lots of inside contacts, and not particularly doing a good job and just towing the party line on other issues and things like that. So you will get variation, just like you do in all systems, where you get good ones and bad ones, and we have to be careful not to tar all with the same brush and kind of go they're all doing a terrible job, because there are plenty of them who are doing a really good job. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found that helpful. This is part of my series on A-level politics, and again in a subgroup of that, my bit on US government and politics. I'm now moving through the section on Congress, and I will continue to add more videos on Congress, and then I will go on to the presidency and the executive and the Supreme Court and all the other issues that we need to cover. And so my intention is that we will end up with a complete set of everything you need for A-level politics, everything you need for component 3 on US government and politics, and it's all building up nicely. So to get notifications as more stuff is added, and I will continually be adding more stuff, then hit subscribe and make sure you turn on notifications so you know when new videos hit. If you have any questions or comments, then please leave them there, and if this has been helpful for you, please hit like. Thank you very much for watching.